The celebration was perfect, almost cinematic in its warmth, the kind of evening that should have felt like a triumph but instead left a strange heaviness in the air that Sarah couldn't quite name. Her husband Marcus had organized everything, the champagne chilled to exactly the right temperature, the small gathering of close friends in their living room, the toast he made that brought tears to everyone's eyes as he spoke about her dedication and brilliance, about how proud he was of her promotion to senior director, about how she deserved every bit of this success, and Sarah stood there smiling, accepting hugs and congratulations, feeling the warmth of recognition wash over her while something underneath, something she couldn't articulate, whispered that the light in the room felt just slightly off, like a photograph with the contrast turned too high. She had worked 7 years for this moment. 7 years of early mornings and late nights, of proving herself in meeting after meeting, of being the woman who always delivered, who never complained, who made excellence look effortless even when it cost her sleep and peace and the quiet moments she used to treasure. And now here it was, the validation she had chased, the title that meant something, the salary increase that would change their financial landscape. And Marcus was celebrating her. Genuinely celebrating, his arm around her waist as he refilled glasses, his laughter genuine as he told stories about how she'd come home exhausted but victorious from particularly difficult negotiations. And everyone in the room saw a supportive husband, a partnership that worked, a marriage where success was shared and celebrated together. But then came the smell, subtle at first, drifting past her as Marcus moved through the room, a fragrance she didn't recognize, sweet and floral with something deeper underneath. Not her perfume, not anything from their home, and Sarah felt her body respond before her mind could catch up. Her stomach tightening, her breath becoming shallow, her amygdala firing warning signals that bypassed rational thought and went straight to her nervous system, flooding her with cortisol. That ancient alarm system that evolution designed to keep us safe from predators, from danger, from threats we might not consciously recognize, but our bodies know, our bodies always know. Carmen's story comes to mind here. Carmen, who was a successful architect, 42 years old with a portfolio that spoke of brilliance and vision, who came to therapy not because her career was struggling, but because she couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, kept having panic attacks in her own home. And when we began to unpack her experience, she described a moment similar to Sarah's, a celebration for her winning a major design competition, her partner David throwing a party, everyone congratulating her, and then a scent, perfume on his collar that wasn't hers, and how her body had responded with such intensity that she'd had to excuse herself to the bathroom, where she'd bent over the sink trying to breathe, trying to understand why her nervous system was screaming danger when everything looked so perfect on the surface. The neuroscience of scent is profound and primitive, smell being the only sense directly connected to the limbic system, that ancient part of our brain where emotion and memory intertwine, where trauma gets stored in our bodies, where our deepest instincts about safety and threat live beneath the reach of conscious thought. And when we encounter a smell that carries danger, even if we don't consciously register why, our body responds immediately, our heart rate increases, our pupils dilate. Stress hormones flood our system, and we are transported not through logical deduction but through sensory recognition to a place of knowing that something is wrong, that the environment we're in is not safe, that the person we're with is not who they appear to be. Sarah tried to dismiss it, tried to focus on the celebration, on the joy that should have filled this moment. But throughout the evening she found herself following that scent, tracking it as Marcus moved through their home, noticing how it seemed stronger near his neck, near his shirt collar, and she watched him with new eyes, observed how he checked his phone more frequently than usual, how his smile seemed just slightly performative, how when their friend Julia asked about his own work he deflected quickly, redirecting attention back to Sarah's achievement. And something in that redirection felt off, felt like misdirection, like a magician drawing your eye to one hand while the other hand performs the trick. The guests left around midnight, warm goodbyes and promises to celebrate again soon, and Sarah stood at the door waving, Marcus's arm still around her waist, the perfect couple in their perfect moment. And when the door closed and they were alone, the silence felt dense, charged with something unspoken, and Marcus turned to her with that smile, that loving smile she'd trusted for 8 years of marriage, and said how proud he was, how this promotion was going to change everything for them, how they could finally plan that trip to Italy they'd always dreamed about, how her success was their success. And Sarah heard the words but kept smelling that perfume, that sweet floral scent that didn't belong in their life. She didn't confront him that night, Something in her needed time to gather evidence, to be sure. Because accusing your husband of betrayal based on a smell seemed absurd, seemed like the kind of paranoia that could destroy a marriage. And so she said she was tired, kissed him goodnight, and lay awake in their bed while he slept peacefully beside her, her mind racing through possibilities, through explanations, through the thousand small moments over recent months that she dismissed or explained away. The late meetings, the new attention to his appearance, the distance she'd attributed to her own busy schedule, to her own focus on the promotion, assuming he was giving her space when maybe he was creating space for someone else. Patricia's experience mirrors this moment of recognition. Patricia, who was a physician, brilliant and dedicated, who'd been married for 12 years when she began to notice small discrepancies. Her husband's schedule not quite matching his explanations. Unfamiliar charges on their credit card that he'd explain away with reasonable-sounding stories. And Patricia, trained in observation and diagnosis, found herself in the strange position of gathering evidence about her own life. Of becoming a detective in her own marriage, feeling both foolish and desperate, because the alternative, confronting without proof, risked being told she was paranoid, was stressed from work, was imagining things, and the gaslighting that could follow would leave her questioning her own perception, her own sanity, her own right to trust what her body and intuition were telling her. The next morning, Sarah woke before Marcus, her promotion celebration already feeling like something from another life, and she moved through their home with new awareness, noticing details she'd overlooked. The way his gym bag was more carefully organized than usual, how his car smelled different, how when she opened his laptop to check their shared calendar, something about the quick way he closed it the night before made her pause, made her wonder what he was protecting. And she felt a wave of shame wash over her, shame that she was suspicious, shame that on the day after her greatest professional achievement she was searching for evidence of betrayal, shame that success in her career seemed somehow connected to discovery of failure in her marriage. The psychology of this moment is crucial to understand. How women especially are conditioned to doubt their own perceptions, to prioritize harmony over truth, to fear being seen as dramatic or paranoid or controlling. And this conditioning runs deep, starts in childhood when little girls are taught to be sweet, to not make trouble, to trust authority figures even when those figures violate boundaries, and carries forward into adult relationships where women will override screaming intuition because confronting would be uncomfortable, would risk the relationship, would make them the problem rather than revealing the problem that already exists. And so they silence themselves, they perform certainty they don't feel. They smile and continue and accommodate while their nervous system quietly drowns in stress hormones. Sarah went to work that day, her first day with the new title, the congratulations from colleagues feeling hollow, and she sat in her new office, larger with a better view, the physical manifestation of success, and felt nothing, felt empty, felt like a woman playing a role in someone else's story. And she realized with sudden clarity that this had been happening for months, this disconnection from her own joy, this sense that achievement was supposed to mean something but somehow didn't. And she'd attributed it to exhaustion, to the natural anticlimax after reaching a goal. But now she wondered if her body had known before her mind, if her subconscious had been picking up signals of betrayal, of danger, of foundation cracking beneath her feet, and her nervous system had been trying to warn her by making joy inaccessible, by creating that numbing distance that depression brings when staying present would be too painful. The amygdala is remarkably sensitive to facial microexpressions, to tone of voice, to body language that doesn't quite match spoken words, and it processes these signals faster than conscious thought, which means we often feel something is wrong before we can articulate why. Our body responds to threat before our mind catches up, and this is protective when the threat is real, when our intuition is picking up genuine danger. But it becomes complicated when we've been taught not to trust ourselves. When we've learned to override our body's wisdom in favor of social conditioning that tells us to be nice, to give the benefit of the doubt, to not make accusations without proof. That evening Marcus came home with flowers. Another celebration, he said, just the two of them. He'd made reservations at her favorite restaurant. And Sarah looked at him, really looked, searching his face for truth, for signs, for something that would confirm or deny what her body was telling her. And she saw love there, or something that looked like love, affection, and pride and the warmth of familiarity. But she also saw something else, something she couldn't name. A flicker behind his eyes when she mentioned the perfume smell from the night before, claiming she thought maybe one of their guests had left a scarf or sweater that still carried fragrance. And Marcus had paused just a microsecond, his pupils dilating slightly, his jaw tightening before he smiled and said he hadn't noticed. Maybe Julia's perfume was just strong. And that pause, that tiny gap between question and answer, told Sarah everything she needed to know. Isabel's story becomes relevant here. Isabel, who was a lawyer, sharp and analytical, who discovered her husband's affair not through dramatic revelation but through accumulation of small inconsistencies, tiny moments that didn't add up. And when she finally confronted him, when she laid out the evidence she'd gathered over weeks of careful observation, he didn't deny it but instead became angry with her for investigating, for not trusting him, for making him feel like a suspect in his own home. And Isabel found herself in the surreal position of being blamed for discovering his betrayal, of somehow being made the villain in a story where she was the victim. And this reversal of accountability, this emotional manipulation that makes the betrayed person responsible for the betrayer's actions, is so common, so predictable that it has a name in psychology. It's called DARVO, deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And it's a tactic that works because it preys on the betrayed person's existing guilt and self-doubt. Sarah didn't go to the restaurant. She told Marcus she wasn't feeling well, a migraine coming on, and he was solicitous, concerned, offered to stay home with her. But she insisted he cancel the reservation and let her rest. And when he finally left, saying he'd just go to the gym since the evening was free, she felt relief at his absence, relief at not having to perform normalcy, at not having to smile and pretend her world wasn't quietly crumbling. And she sat in the dark living room, in the same spot where they'd celebrated her promotion just 24 hours earlier, and let herself feel the full weight of what she knew, what her body had been trying to tell her, that the perfume smell wasn't from a guest, that Marcus's recent distance wasn't about giving her space for her career, that his support of her promotion might have been genuine but it was also convenient, perhaps welcome. Because a wife focused on her career is a wife less focused on her husband's whereabouts. The neuroscience of betrayal trauma is devastating to understand. When someone we love and trust betrays us, particularly in an intimate relationship, it doesn't just hurt emotionally. It affects our brain structure, our ability to trust, our capacity for secure attachment, because the person who is supposed to be our safe haven becomes the source of threat, and this creates what's called cognitive dissonance, where our brain struggles to hold two contradictory pieces of information simultaneously. This person loves me and this person is betraying me. And the stress of maintaining both beliefs actually damages the hippocampus, impairs memory formation, creates the fog and confusion that betrayed partners describe, where they can't think clearly, can't remember simple things, feel like they're losing their mind. Because in a sense, the traumatic stress is affecting their brain's ability to function normally. Sarah began looking, really looking. And within days she found what her intuition had already known: text messages Marcus thought he'd deleted, recovered from cloud backup, conversations with someone named Amber that went back 5 months, that started professional, something about a work project, and gradually became personal, became intimate, became explicit. And Sarah read them all, every word, torturing herself with the details, with how Marcus described her, his wife, as busy and ambitious and increasingly distant, with how he talked about feeling lonely, feeling unseen, with how Amber seemed to understand him in ways Sarah apparently didn't. And there was something particularly cruel about reading these messages the same week she'd achieved her greatest professional success, about understanding that while she was fighting for promotion, for recognition, for the career she'd sacrificed so much to build, her husband was building intimacy with someone else, was seeking recognition and attention outside their marriage, was creating a parallel life she knew nothing about. The timing wasn't coincidental, and this is important to understand from a psychological perspective. Often affairs intensify or are discovered around major life transitions, promotions, moves, pregnancies, any shift in family dynamics that changes the power balance or attention distribution in a relationship. And for some people, particularly those with fragile egos or deep needs for validation, a partner's success can feel threatening, can trigger old wounds around not being enough, not being special, not being the center of attention, and rather than doing the internal work to address these feelings, rather than celebrating their partner's achievement and examining their own insecurity, they seek validation elsewhere. They create a situation where they feel powerful and desired and central, where they don't have to face their own inadequacy or jealousy or fear. Marcus came home that night to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table with his phone, the messages pulled up on both screens. And his face went through a series of transformations. Shock to fear to calculation to anger, and he started with denial. Those aren't what they look like, taken out of context, just a friend going through a hard time. And when Sarah didn't respond, when she just sat there with devastation plain on her face, he switched to justification. She was never home, always working. He felt neglected. He needed connection. Didn't she see how her ambition had pushed him away? And Sarah felt something crack inside her, felt the full force of his manipulation, because here he was, caught in betrayal, trying to make his affair her fault, trying to make her career success the cause of his moral failure, trying to rewrite their story so that she was responsible for his choices, for his lies, for his decision to seek intimacy with someone else instead of addressing problems in their marriage. The conversation that followed was brutal and revealing, Marcus oscillating between remorse and defensiveness, between begging for forgiveness and justifying his actions. And Sarah watched this man she'd loved for 8 years, this man she'd built a life with, and saw clearly for perhaps the first time how much of their relationship had been about managing his ego, accommodating his needs, making herself smaller so he could feel bigger. And she understood with painful clarity that her promotion hadn't caused this affair. Her success had merely revealed what was always there, his inability to celebrate her without feeling diminished, his need to be the primary earner, the primary achiever, the center of attention and admiration. And when that dynamic shifted, when she stepped into her own power and recognition, he couldn't handle it, couldn't be genuinely happy for her, could only find ways to reassert his importance by creating a scenario where someone made him feel special. Carmen's experience after her discovery was similar, the shock giving way to a deeper recognition, seeing her entire relationship through new eyes, remembering all the times David had subtly undermined her confidence, made jokes about her career that weren't quite jokes, positioned himself as the more creative one, the more talented one, while she was just technical, just practical, and how she'd absorbed these messages, had started to doubt her own vision, her own gifts. Had made herself less threatening by downplaying her achievements, and the affair wasn't just about sex or connection. It was about power, about David's need to maintain dominance, to keep Carmen in a position where she needed him, depended on him, looked up to him, and her winning that design competition had disrupted that dynamic, had put her in the spotlight, had made him feel overshadowed. And so he'd created a situation where he was again the powerful one, the desired one. The one with secrets and control. Sarah spent the next weeks moving through what felt like multiple realities simultaneously. She was the successful senior director who led meetings and made strategic decisions. And she was the devastated wife who couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, whose world had shattered. And reconciling these two versions of herself felt impossible. She was strong and she was broken. She was victorious and she was defeated. And the psychological whiplash was exhausting, her cortisol levels constantly elevated. Her nervous system stuck in fight or flight, her body paying the price for emotional trauma while her mind tried to maintain professional competence. Marcus moved out at her request, claimed he wanted to work on himself, understand why he'd made these choices, and Sarah was left in their home surrounded by the debris of their life together. And she found herself not just grieving the marriage that had ended but grieving the marriage she'd thought they had, mourning the illusion, the story she'd believed about who they were together. And this double grief is particular to betrayal. You lose the relationship and you lose your trust in your own judgment. Your ability to discern truth from lies, to know when you're being manipulated, to trust your own perception of reality. Patricia's journey through this recognition phase was marked by a similar disorientation. She'd prided herself on being observant, on being analytical, and yet she'd missed or explained away months of signs. And this shook her confidence not just in her marriage but in herself, in her ability to read situations, to trust her instincts. And she struggled with profound shame. Shame that she hadn't known, hadn't seen, hadn't protected herself. And this shame, this sense of having failed by being betrayed, is so common among women who discover infidelity, as if they should have prevented their partner's choice to violate trust, as if loving someone means being responsible for their behavior, as if betrayal is something that happens because the betrayed person wasn't enough rather than because the betrayer chose deception. Sarah started therapy, not to save her marriage but to save herself, to understand how she'd ended up here, how she'd given so much of herself to a relationship that wasn't reciprocal, how she'd learned to override her own needs and intuition in service of keeping peace, of being the good wife, of not being too demanding or too needy or too much. And through therapy she began to trace these patterns back to childhood, to growing up with a father who raged and a mother who accommodated, who taught Sarah by example that women's role was to manage men's emotions, to stay small so men could feel big, to sacrifice their own needs to maintain relationship harmony. And Sarah had learned this lesson well, had carried it into her adult relationships, had made herself smaller and smaller even as her career grew larger, had learned to dim her light so Marcus wouldn't feel overshadowed. The inner child work became crucial here, Sarah connecting with the younger version of herself who'd learned that love meant sacrifice, that being valued meant being useful, that her worth was conditional on others' approval. And she began to see how that frightened little girl, desperate for her father's approval and unable to earn it, had grown into a woman desperate to be enough for a man who would never be satisfied, who would always find something lacking, something to criticize, some way to position himself as superior. And the promotion, the recognition of her genuine competence and worth, had threatened this entire dynamic, had exposed the imbalance, had made visible what had always been true but she'd been too loyal, too committed, too hopeful to see. Isabel's therapy involved similar excavation, understanding how she'd learned early that her intelligence was threatening to others, that being smart meant being alone, and so she'd learned to hide her brilliance, to ask questions she already knew the answers to position men as teachers even when she was more knowledgeable, to protect their egos at the expense of her authenticity. And her husband had been attracted to this performance, had loved the Isabel who made him feel smart and capable and superior, but had felt threatened when the real Isabel, the brilliant strategist, started to emerge professionally, started to take up space, started to stop pretending she didn't know more than he did about many things. Sarah's healing involved learning to trust herself again, to honor the intuition that had been screaming warnings she'd tried to silence, to recognize that the smell, that perfume that triggered her amygdala, wasn't paranoia but perception, her body telling her what her mind wasn't ready to know. And she began to see how often throughout the marriage she'd overridden these internal signals, dismissed her own discomfort, explained away her own unease. And she made a commitment to herself that she would never again silence her inner knowing, that she would trust the wisdom of her nervous system, that when something felt wrong she would pay attention rather than performing confidence she didn't. The grief came in waves, unpredictable and overwhelming. She would be fine, functional, moving through her day. And then suddenly the loss would hit her, the magnitude of what had been destroyed, not just the marriage but her belief in marriage, in partnership, in the possibility of being truly seen and loved while also being powerful and successful. And she grieved for the years she'd given, for the compromises she'd made, for the version of herself she'd suppressed to make room for his ego. And she grieved for the future she'd imagined, the life they were supposed to build together, the dreams that had dissolved with his betrayal. But alongside the grief came something else, something unexpected, a sense of relief, of liberation, of no longer having to manage his emotions, to make herself smaller, to walk on eggshells around his fragility. And Sarah began to notice how much energy she'd been expending just maintaining the relationship, how exhausting it had been to constantly accommodate, to prioritize his needs, to celebrate his mediocre achievements while downplaying her exceptional ones. And without that constant emotional labor, without that perpetual vigilance, she felt lighter, freer, more herself than she'd been in years. Carmen described a similar experience, the shock of loss giving way gradually to recognition of how constrained she'd been, how much of herself she'd sacrificed, how many opportunities she'd declined or ideas she'd suppressed because they would have made David uncomfortable, threatened his position as the creative genius in the relationship. And as painful as the affair had been, as devastating as the betrayal felt, there was also a strange gratitude emerging, gratitude that the illusion had shattered. That she could finally stop pretending, stop performing, stop making herself less to make him more. Sarah's relationship with her promotion shifted as she healed. Initially it had felt tainted, connected to the discovery of betrayal, to the worst period of her life. But gradually she began to reclaim it, to recognize her achievement as separate from his failure, her success as independent of his insecurity. And she started to see the promotion not as a cause of the affair, but as a catalyst that exposed what was already broken, that revealed the fundamental inequality in their relationship. The ways Marcus had needed her to be lesser for him to feel greater, and she felt angry, righteously angry, that her professional triumph had been overshadowed by his personal betrayal, that she couldn't purely celebrate her achievement because it was tangled up with the worst discovery of her life. The anger was healthy, necessary, a sign that Sarah was no longer blaming herself, no longer accepting Marcus's narrative that her ambition had driven him away. And in therapy, she learned about the concept of righteous anger, anger that protects boundaries, that says this is not acceptable, that refuses to accommodate abuse or betrayal. And she let herself feel the full force of it, let herself rage at the injustice. At how she'd worked so hard for so long only to discover that her greatest professional achievement coincided with her husband's most profound personal betrayal. At how he'd smiled and toasted her success while maintaining an affair. How he'd made love to her while thinking of someone else. How he'd looked in her eyes and lied repeatedly, consistently, without apparent remorse. Patricia's anger came later, after the shock and grief. And when it came, it was volcanic, years of accumulated resentment and suppressed rage at all the times she'd made herself small. All the times she'd accommodated and compromised and explained away disrespect. And she let herself feel it fully, didn't try to be the bigger person or move to forgiveness prematurely, understood that anger was part of healing, that it marked the end of self-blame and the beginning of self-protection. And her therapist helped her understand that women are socialized to fear their own anger, to see it as ugly or destructive or unfeminine. But anger is simply information. It tells us when boundaries have been violated, when we're being treated unacceptably, when we need to protect ourselves. Sarah's journey toward healing involved rebuilding her sense of self, separate from any relationship, discovering who she was when she wasn't constantly accommodating someone else's ego. And she started slowly, taking herself to dinner, to movies, doing things she'd always wanted to do but had suppressed because Marcus wasn't interested. And she discovered she loved contemporary dance, spent hours at galleries looking at art, started writing poetry again. Something she'd abandoned years ago because Marcus had made dismissive comments that had wounded her more deeply than she'd acknowledged at the time. The neural pathways of self-discovery work through repetition and positive reinforcement. Every time Sarah chose herself, honored her own preferences, followed her own curiosity, she was literally rewiring her brain, strengthening connections between action and positive emotion, building new associations that said her needs matter, her desires are valid, her choices have worth independent of anyone else's approval. And this neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new connections and patterns throughout life, meant that healing wasn't just emotional but physical. Her brain was literally changing, creating new possibilities for how she related to herself and others. 6 months after Marcus moved out, Sarah filed for divorce, not in anger but in clarity, understanding that the relationship had been fundamentally imbalanced, that Marcus had shown her through his actions who he was, someone who couldn't truly celebrate her success, who needed to diminish her to feel elevated, who would betray her rather than address his own insecurity. And she knew that staying would mean returning to old patterns, making herself small again, and she'd rather be alone than be diminished. Would rather face uncertainty than return to a relationship that required her suppression. The divorce was contentious. Marcus suddenly concerned about money, about the promotion that meant Sarah now outearned him significantly, and his lawyer positioned him as the victim, the husband who'd supported his wife's career only to be cast aside now that she was successful. And Sarah watched this rewriting of history with a kind of fascinated horror, seeing how easily the story could be manipulated, how he could position himself as supportive when he'd actually been undermining, as loving when he'd been betraying, and she was grateful for her lawyer, for her therapist, for her own clarity about what had actually happened. Carmen's divorce had similar dynamics, David claiming she'd abandoned their marriage for her career, that her success had changed her, made her cold and distant. And initially Carmen had struggled against this narrative, tried to prove it wasn't true. But eventually she'd stopped defending herself, stopped trying to control David's story, and simply focused on the truth she knew, that she'd been a devoted partner who'd accommodated his ego at great cost to herself. That his affair wasn't about her failures but his choices, that her success didn't cause his betrayal. It only revealed his inability to celebrate her without feeling threatened. Sarah emerged from the divorce wounded but intact, financially stable, professionally thriving, and beginning to discover aspects of herself she'd long suppressed. And she started to notice how differently she moved through the world, no longer anticipating criticism, no longer bracing for judgment, no longer making herself smaller to make others comfortable. And colleagues commented on the change, said she seemed more confident, more powerful, more fully herself. And Sarah understood that what they were seeing wasn't new confidence but the absence of constant accommodation, wasn't new power, but the release of energy she'd been spending on managing someone else's fragility. The neuroscience of post-traumatic growth is fascinating and hopeful. Research shows that people who experience trauma and then do the work of healing don't just return to baseline. They often emerge with greater resilience, deeper self-knowledge, more authentic relationships, enhanced appreciation for life. Because trauma, when properly processed, breaks open our defended places, challenges our assumptions, forces us to question narratives we've accepted without examination. And this breaking open, while painful, creates possibility for real transformation, for building a life based on truth rather than performance, on authenticity rather than accommodation. Sarah's relationship with success shifted fundamentally. She no longer sought external validation as proof of worth, no longer needed achievement to feel valuable, because she'd done the work of understanding that her worth was inherent, not earned, that she was valuable because she existed, not because she performed or produced or pleased. And from this place of inherent worth, success became something different, not a desperate chase for approval but a natural expression of her gifts. Her work mattered because it was meaningful to her, because it aligned with her values, because it let her contribute and create, not because it proved anything about her value. Isabel's transformation involved similar shifts. She stopped performing brilliance and started inhabiting it, stopped hiding her intelligence and started sharing it freely, stopped protecting men's egos and started expecting them to manage their own emotional responses. And she was amazed by how many relationships fell away when she stopped accommodating. How many people had been in her life not because they valued her, but because they valued what she did for them, how she made them feel, how she served their needs. And the grief of these losses was real, but so was the relief, the freedom, the spaciousness that came from releasing relationships built on false foundations. Sarah started dating eventually, cautiously, bringing all her hard-won wisdom into new connections. And she was different now. She noticed red flags immediately, didn't explain them away, didn't give second chances to men who showed her through actions they weren't capable of genuine partnership. And she learned to trust her body's responses. When her stomach tightened in someone's presence, she paid attention. When her nervous system relaxed, she noticed that too. And she understood that her amygdala, that ancient alarm system, was her ally, not something to override but something to honor. The men she dated found her both compelling and challenging. She was warm but boundaried, open but discerning, vulnerable but not desperate. And some men didn't know what to do with a woman who was fully present but not performing, who was genuinely interested but not trying to please, who would walk away from potential rather than compromise her peace. And Sarah learned that this was fine, that incompatibility was information, that not every connection needed to be pursued or preserved, that her energy was valuable and should be spent on people who added to her life rather than requiring constant accommodation. Carmen's dating experience was similar. She was attracted to different men now, not the charming performers but the steady presences, not the men who needed her to reflect their greatness but the men who had their own secure sense of self, who could celebrate her without feeling threatened, who wanted partnership not performance. And when she met someone who fit this description, a quiet engineer named Thomas who listened more than he talked, who asked thoughtful questions about her work, who seemed genuinely delighted by her brilliance rather than intimidated by it, she approached the relationship differently than she would have before, more slowly, more carefully, more honestly. Sarah's promotion, which had been so tangled up with betrayal and discovery, eventually became what it should have been: a recognition of her gifts, an acknowledgement of her contributions, a step forward in work that mattered to her. And she claimed it fully, stopped letting Marcus's affair overshadow her achievement, stopped allowing his inability to celebrate her to diminish her celebration of herself. And she threw herself another party just with close friends, people who genuinely loved her. And this time there was no undercurrent of danger, no smell that didn't belong, no husband performing support while maintaining betrayal, just authentic joy, genuine connection, real celebration. The healing wasn't linear. There were still hard days, moments when grief would ambush her, when she'd see couples and feel the loss of what she'd hoped her marriage would be, when she'd question whether she'd ever trust anyone fully again, whether she was damaged beyond repair, whether the betrayal had broken something essential in her capacity for intimacy. And her therapist reminded her that healing isn't about never feeling pain, it's about not being controlled by it. It's about feeling the feelings fully and then returning to center, to the truth of who you are beneath the trauma. Patricia's healing journey included a similar recognition, that she would always carry the scar of betrayal. But scars are proof of healing, evidence that the body knit itself back together, that wounds closed, that life continued. And she started to see her experience not as something that happened to her, but as something she survived, that surviving had taught her, had strengthened her, had shown her what she was capable of. And from this perspective, the affair, as painful as it was, became a catalyst for transformation she might never have undertaken if everything had stayed comfortable and false. Sarah's relationship with herself deepened in ways she couldn't have imagined before. She learned to comfort herself when distressed, to celebrate herself when successful, to forgive herself when imperfect, to speak to herself with the kindness she'd always extended to others. And this self-relationship became the foundation for everything else, the secure base from which she could explore and risk and create, knowing that even if external relationships failed, even if plans fell through, even if she was rejected or disappointed or hurt, she had herself, would always have herself, would never abandon herself the way she'd learned to never abandon herself again. The inner child work continued, Sarah regularly connecting with the younger version of herself who needed so desperately to be seen and valued. And she gave that little girl what she'd never received from her father, what she'd sought from Marcus: unconditional acceptance, delight in her existence, celebration of her gifts. And as she reparented herself, as she gave herself what she'd always needed, something fundamental shifted. She stopped seeking external validation, stopped needing anyone to complete her, stopped looking for someone to finally see her worth because she saw it, she knew it, she lived from it. Carmen's inner child work revealed similar patterns. A little girl who'd learned to hide her intelligence, to downplay her insights, to let others shine so she could belong. An adult Carmen began speaking to this little girl with fierce protection, promising she would never hide again, never diminish herself again, never prioritize others' comfort over her own authenticity again. And this promise, made to herself, kept to herself, became the foundation of her integrity, the core commitment from which all other choices flowed. Sarah's life, 2 years after that promotion celebration, looked completely different. She lived alone in a smaller apartment she loved, filled with art and books and the remnants of hobbies she was rediscovering. She had deep friendships with women who'd supported her through the dissolution of her marriage. She was dating someone kind and steady who seemed genuinely proud of her success, who celebrated her achievements without needing to diminish them or himself, who could hold space for her complexity, her pain, her joy, her growth. And she approached this new relationship with both hope and realism, knowing that no one could complete her because she was already complete. That partnership was a choice, not a necessity, that she would rather be alone than compromised. The promotion had led her to a senior vice president role, her trajectory clear and strong, and she led with a different energy now, more authentic, less performative. She made space for others to grow, celebrated their success genuinely, created environments where people could be complex and human. And her team thrived. Productivity increased not through pressure but through genuine engagement, through people feeling seen and valued and challenged in ways that called forth their best rather than demanding their constant performance. Patricia's career had similar trajectory. She became chief of her department, known for brilliant diagnostic skills but also for profound humanity, for treating patients as whole people rather than collections of symptoms. And her leadership style reflected her healing. She was boundaried but compassionate, demanding but supportive. She expected excellence but made space for humanity. And her team was fiercely loyal, not because she demanded loyalty, but because she earned it through consistent integrity. Sarah occasionally thought about Marcus, wondered if he understood what he'd lost, if he'd done the work to understand why he'd betrayed, if he was different with Amber or if he was repeating the same patterns. And she found she could think about him without rage, without devastation, just with a kind of sad clarity, seeing him as a wounded person who'd wounded her, someone unable to do better with the tools and awareness he had. And she felt grateful, strangely grateful, that his betrayal had forced her to examine her life, to break patterns, to discover herself. Because staying in that marriage would have meant slow suffocation, gradual diminishment, a life half-lived in service of maintaining false peace. Carmen felt similar gratitude. Painful as the affair had been, it had shattered illusions she'd needed shattered, had shown her what she was tolerating, had given her permission to want more, to demand more, to expect more, not just from partners but from herself. And her relationship with Thomas was different from anything she'd experienced before, built on truth rather than performance, on mutual respect rather than accommodation, on genuine celebration rather than threatened ego. And she understood that she couldn't have had this relationship before, wouldn't have been ready for it, wouldn't have been able to receive real love because she'd been too busy performing worthiness rather than inhabiting it. Sarah's story isn't about the affair, not really. It's about a woman who learned to trust herself, who chose authenticity over accommodation, who built a life from the inside out rather than from external validation in. And the affair was catalyst, painful teacher, unwelcome gift that broke open defended places and forced real examination, real growth, real transformation, and she wouldn't choose to go through it again, but she wouldn't undo it either because it led her here, to this life, to this self. To this profound peace that comes from knowing who you are and refusing to be anyone else. The smell of perfume that night, that scent that triggered her amygdala and set everything in motion, was her body's wisdom speaking, her intuition refusing to be silenced, her nervous system protecting her by alerting her to danger her mind wasn't ready to see, and learning to trust these signals, to honor her body's knowing, to never again override her instincts for the comfort of others. This became Sarah's foundation, the ground truth from which everything else grew. And so she moved through her life now with both softness and strength, open but boundaried, vulnerable but protected, willing to risk but willing to walk away. And the promotion that had once felt tainted became what it should have been: recognition of her gifts, acknowledgement of her worth, step forward in meaningful work. And she claimed it fully, celebrated it genuinely, let it be what it was: her achievement, her success, her triumph, independent of anyone else's response to it. Requiring no one's permission or approval, simply hers, earned through dedication and brilliance and showing up fully as herself. And that claiming of her own success and her own life and her own worth was the real victory, the transformation that mattered most, the healing that changed everything.